Well, good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation by Nancy Sherman. My name is Mark Herlihy. I am the director of Endicott's Tadler Center for the Humanities, Associate Dean of the College of School of Arts and Sciences, and Chair of Humanities. We very much appreciate your joining us today. Normally, we would host such an event in person, and we would have copies of our speaker's latest book for sale. The official publication date of Dr. Sherman's book, Stoic Wisdom, is not until May 11th, but I will provide a link in the chat to anyone who would like to pre-order the book. There will also be time for question and answer and discussion. If you would like to pose a question, please use the chat function. Professor William Young and Professor Gabrielle Watling will moderate the Q&A. The honor of introducing our distinguished speaker goes to junior communication major, Megan Hemingway. Megan?
Nancy Sherman is university professor and professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. She's published 7 books on ethics, drawing from ancient philosophy and addressing subjects ranging from moral psychology to the ethics of warfare and treatment of post-war trauma. For her work, she's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies, and many other fellowships and honors. Along with her academic scholarship, she has written for many newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. When not practicing philosophy, she loves to hike, garden, dance, and cook. We are very pleased to host Professor Sherman here at Endicott College to share with us reflections from her forthcoming book, Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience, published by Oxford University Press and available on May 11th. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Sherman.
Well, thank you so much. I so wish I was up on the North Shore with you, but I'm not, and we're staying safe, and maybe we'll all be in our campuses soon. That's the hope for Georgetown. So this is the best we can do, and I really want to thank Mark, Willie, and Gab, the latter two teaching their Art of War class that was the occasion for bringing us together. And Mark, thank you so much for sponsoring this through the Tadler Center for the Humanities. It's a great treat. So I'm going to, on occasion, if I can figure it out well, share screens with you. It's mostly visuals just to keep us alive and not alive, we're that, but alert and alive, as I tell my students. So the book, Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience, really was written during this pandemic, but it's had a long sort of rumination, cogitation period. And that is, I've been thinking for a long time about the coalescence and tension between what I'll call moral injury, I'll define it in a moment, but the moral anguish of war and the psychological anguish, and how that squares or doesn't with the Stoic ethos of the military. And I've been working with the military for the better part of 2-3 decades. And so I really feel very strongly that there's a tension there, and I've been trying to resolve it. So let me begin with a story very fitting today, since the New York Times has, those of you who don't get the print, it is time to end the forever war. And so let me begin really there, the beginning of that forever war. So it was just 3 weeks after 9/11, and I was at Dulles Airport here in DC, headed to meet someone whose name was Admiral Stockdale, Jim Stockdale. And I was anxious about flying, but we had a commitment and I was going to go out. Now he's probably, maybe to some of you, known his lesser image is as the failed running mate of Ross Perot. But he was the person really who gave the military, the post-Vietnam era military, stoicism. And so let me just give you a sense of this. And so let me now share the screen a little bit. So just give me a half second to pull things up if I can, please. Whoop, that didn't work, did it? Let's see, let's get that going. How's that? We're good? Thumbs up? You can't see it?
I can't see it yet.
Oh, you're screen sharing. I am screen sharing. Where is Chris? Can you?
Right here.
Okay.
I'm going to have you stop your share real quick and we'll try that again.
Okay. You tell me when.
So go ahead and try again and make sure we can see which window you want to select once you click share screen.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, here we go.
Do you see the option for your presentation?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so you should be able to click that and then click share.
Okay, I have two possibilities, and let's see if I can get that. Are we there? Yes or no? No. Okay, one more time. That would be terrible. We just had it going a moment. Stop share. I don't know what's going on here. Give me a half sec. And hold on. Try this. Yes or no?
There we go.
Oh, okay. Too many things going on. I'm just gonna. Okay, is that good? Okay, super. So we'll move through this. So there's Jim Stockdale getting out of. He's a naval aviator, and here he is as a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, and I'll give you a sense of it right now. So he was shot down September 9, 1965, and his prescient words were, "I'm leaving behind the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus." 5 years down there. Well, it turned out to be 7.5 years down there, 2.5 of which he was in solitary isolation, confinement. And down the hall from him was someone who may be a better known POW, and that was John McCain. And when he hit the ground, he was pummeled by a crowd and broke a leg. And the idea of a lame leg resonated with him because Epictetus, who was a enslaved Phrygian and then Roman around the time of Nero, also had a broken leg and came to write these things called the Discourses. And the short book is the Enchiridion. Now, Stockdale was at Stanford given the Enchiridion and this book, Epictetus's Handbook, and he sort of joked with me when we met in Coronado near San Diego that day. He said, "What would a martini drinking, golf loving aviator want with a book like that?" But he committed it to memory, and it became his salvation. And in fact, he's been studied as someone who turned to Stoicism for salvation during times of deprivation. So his story resonates with many in the military community. When I taught at the Naval Academy, many knew about him, had read Epictetus, and it was their philosophy as well. Now, that question of Stoicism as a military ethos often haunts me because it's not always a healthy ethos. It's an ethos of, in a less elegant and eloquent phrase, is embrace the suck. Suck it up and truck on, another version of it, which I've heard many, many times in military communities. And what we now know is that many in the military, and not just in the military, but in society in general, suffer in the wake of traumatic incidents, either post-traumatic stress, that's by and large a fear response, a conditioned fear response, or moral injury. And the way it's defined by those clinicians working on it is that it's a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. So it's as if you have a shattered moral identity, I've heard very often those who suffer it say in their own words. And it can be from the point of view of you as agent, so perpetrator for real or apparent transgressions, omissions, commissions, as we say. It can be from you as the point of someone who is acted upon as a victim or as a close-up bystander. And this is, I want to give you a very to my mind, a very moving picture of moral injury suffered by a close-up bystander. Let's see why, if I can now that I'm sharing this, here we go. This is Somalia. Black Hawk Down may resonate with some of you. And this is Sergeant Cleveland, who was shot by a Toronto Star journalist who later got a Pulitzer for this. His name is Paul Watson, 1993. Watson believes he heard Cleveland say at the time of that incident, "If you do this, I will own you forever." Meaning, you're exposing me. It's a very sensitive picture. But the shoot is obviously not a shoot in the sense of lethality, but it's a camera shoot. But it felt as if it were something other than that. And so the photo ended up actually getting us out of Somalia. Bill Clinton took this photo very seriously, and it was the end of our engagement in Somalia. So what you begin to see is that moral injury is a response to a challenge. The challenge is moral. It's not a response specifically to fear, life threat, but the symptoms overlap in the sense of you could have flashbacks, you could have hypervigilance, arousal, you could dissociate, want to leave the world in some way and not socialize. But what's the leading edge are feelings, such moral feelings. In philosophy, we sometimes call them reactive attitudes: shame, guilt, anger, that's moral rage, resentment, a sense of betrayal. It could also be a sense of terrible moral disappointment in yourself. So service members are working in high stakes situations. They deal with lethal lethality. They deal with weapons. They are extremely careful, or they're held to be accountable for whether what they do, what they leave behind, and whether their rifles are in the right order, et cetera. So the question is, how does the stoicism that the military typically embrace mesh, if at all, with the moral injury that many suffer? And this is not just an academic question. I teach military regularly. I lecture to executive officers in the military. They subscribe often to some version of Stoicism, but they also, themselves included, suffer moral injury. Can they turn to the Stoic texts for enlightenment, or do they have to turn their back on that and view moral injury as something very different from the Stoicism that they embrace? That's really the question, and that's what I take up in Stoic wisdom as well. So let me give you this example. It begins in Kosovo, but it takes you up to Iraq. So naval aviator, his name is Lane McDowell, and he graduates from the Naval Academy in 1995, a stellar aviator. And he's in Kosovo. And one of the missions is, the imagery is coming in a little grainy. He's flying, he's going to drop a very large sortie, and the Serbian air defense open up. Now, if you remember back in the days of Kosovo, American troops, aviators were flying fairly high. And his eye is taken off the screen for half a second or so. Still, as he drops the bomb, he says, "I felt really good about the release." But then clouds start to obscure the sight, and he starts to feel some dread. And when he gets back into the carrier, these large carriers of 5,000 persons or so, he looks at the big screen and unmistakably he sees a carport, and he sees right in the carport 4 children's-sized bikes. So there were never any legal proceedings. The Pentagon kind of dropped it, but he did his own after incident debrief, and it came in a repetitive dream. And the dream was essentially this. The building was still standing. There was a lot of dust everywhere, wires dangling. And in the corner, huddled in the corner, was a little child. And he was still breathing, and Lane McDowell went to cradle the child. And as he's holding the child, he sees that there's no back of his head, but he sees from the front that it's his own son, Lane McDowell's son, Landon. Now, this was not from a direct interview I did. This is from C.J. Chivers, or Chris Chivers, New York Times war correspondent, who himself a Marine, and he followed a number of individuals and tells about them in The Fighters. And this is an accident. It's not collateral incident. This was a strike with a target. But, and he was not legally culpable for a failure, but he does his own, as I said, after incident assessment. And on his view, he failed. He holds himself strictly liable, though you might say the fog of war literally intervened. So I take this to be a really stunning case of moral injury, because even though the doctrine of war exculpates this fighter, the fighter himself can't. So the question really is this the grandiosity of moral perfection at work? Service members can be a very morally high-flying crowd. Black and white morality is my view, having taught at many of the academies, rigid often. They're held to very, very high standards. And yet they work in a world of gray, the gray of and fog of war. But if you think of shunting all of the injury, moral injury, to psychological overreach, I think you miss the moral lesson. And that is, even if you can't always count on our moral reactive attitude sensitivities to track what's really morally permissible or right and wrong, they still get at our moral aspirations. And if service members didn't feel these, I think we would think they were lacking in some sort of humanity. So the question is, if you live and breathe a Stoic ethos, where it's a kind of tough grit, suck it up mentality, or at least that's how you think Stoicism reads. I'm not sure it is, but that's your view of it. How do you deal with these kinds of responses to moral accident? And not just accident. Maybe the cause of war isn't just. Maybe it was when we first went in. Today's a great example. We're announcing a pullout from Afghanistan. Many think that the engagement in Afghanistan was probably just initially a response to a defense response. It's not clear, it still is. We're not achieving our missions. So if you're a soldier, a Marine, an aviator, a sailor on the ground in missions, how do you wrestle with all that? And I mentioned that in a very heartfelt way in this paper that I just picked up today. The lead story over here is by Thomas Gibbons Neff. He was my student, T.M. Gibbons Neff, a number of years ago. He had just returned from Marcia. He now works for the New York Times and is in Kabul. And he was a sniper where things didn't go so well for a few days. And that is sort of how he arrived in my office. And he now writes about this. He's been there. It's almost 20 years now. So these are weighty questions. So what do the Stoics talk? Let's see if I can move this along. Whoop. Let's see how I can, sorry about this. Next. next. That's Chivers. Okay, how did the Stoics deal with this? But before I show you how the Stoics deal with this, let's just look at a graphic, artistic image of some moral injury. And these come from the National Center and NICO, National Intrepid Center of Excellence, over near where I am at Bethesda Naval now, Walter Reed. So let's see if I can move these along. This is a sense of being mired in mud. Can't move, can't do much. This is the person who made that, Jeff Hall, wearing a mask. And these masks are featured in the National Geographic magazine from a ways back. But similarly, I'm not sure why that's doing that, but something's not stable here. Similarly, on the halls of Walter Reed. Let's see if I can do it this way. Nope. TBI, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Very graphic, I think. Fear, pain, guilt, pain, remorse. And a lot of emotions. Divided self. I feel like I have 1,000 paper cuts, someone said. A sense of a brain being exploded. Pain, TBI, fatigue, confusion. So this is physical, mental, moral. This sense of being locked up. This is a map of Iraq, Afghanistan. We saw that one. Team 4, team sergeant, squad sergeant. They're erased out, their lives lost. This one is quite something. A lot of sense of honor, commitment, country. Whoop. This is very sad, I think. The tears are very sad. Where do we go from here? And yet another question mark. Forgive me, it's a little jumpy. I'm not sure why it's jumping, but I think you get the picture here. This one is very hard to see and hard to behold. An empty core after killing an innocent on orders. These are the meds. And whoop, no idea why we're having this trouble, but forgive me. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment just to see if we can clear a little of the jumpiness. Forgive me for that. Okay, so you get a sense. That's moral injury now, today. Very graphically as part of art therapy that works with talk therapy and sometimes dance therapy. And these masks were typically made in tables. I've been in the studio where they're made. Tables of 4 folks working together for maybe an hour or so, and then they break into other forms of therapy at different times of the day, including yoga and relaxation techniques. So let's try to think about moral injury from the point of view of the Stoics. Can they tell us something about it? So they don't tell us specifically about moral injury, but they do talk about moral distress and moral anxiety, we might say. And they want us to sort of go backwards, and a challenge is posed, and it's an important challenge that's posed by Cicero. So the claim is, okay, even if a sage will never feel moral distress, because a sage can do no wrong, and here they just inherit something from Socrates. The good person does no wrong, and so the good person has nothing to feel distress about, moral distress. But what if you're not a sage? Or what if you think you did something wrong, even if you didn't? And so, you have hindsight bias. You wouldn't have dropped that bomb that day if you gave yourself greater pause for a few seconds. So what happens if you're us in non-ideal conditions, suffering the constraints that come with all of us fallible agents, and we either in fact screw up or are in the wrong war, or the rules of engagement are too permissive, which is often the case, or the rules of engagement are too restrictive, you lose your buddies if you don't lose the non-combatants when they're more restrictive. What do you do about all this? So the challenge comes in this way, and I'll be brief here. The challenge is, if you remember the end of the symposium, those of you that have read some Plato, Alcibiades, he's sort of the bad boy of Greek history. He comes in rushing and says, Socrates is the only person who can really make me feel ashamed, because Socrates is so virtuous. But every time I'm in front of Socrates, I realize how I fall short. And so you didn't think I could be ashamed? I can, he says, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I really can feel shame. And I feel shame when I'm before my moral tutor, Socrates. And so that becomes a challenge, a kind of meme. And Cicero remembers it very well. And he asks the old Stoics, the old Greek Stoics, one of them Cleanthes, he says, don't you remember what Alcibiades said? He said that, that he felt moral distress when he wasn't virtuous enough. Isn't that a good thing? Is essentially the challenge. Can't moral distress be a recognition that you did or may have done wrong? And the words Cicero uses, an impulse to change, an impulse toward virtue. And if it's an impulse toward virtue, then the question is, well, we've just seen it can be overly punitive. You can rack yourself suicidally, which we know has happened in the past 20 years. There's been a suicide epidemic in the military. But you also can repair. And so the question to pose to the Stoic texts are, where do they talk about that? Do they talk about that? Do they have an answer to the challenge that Cicero raises? Now, Cicero isn't a Stoic, he's a fellow traveler. He's one of the reasons we have the Stoic texts. He moves them from Greek into Latin. He's sort of the redactor, expositor, preserver of the texts. So what do we say about this? And here's a way to think about it. As I read the Stoics and I look at a wide panoply of texts, one of the Stoics I particularly like to read is Seneca. And sometimes it's Seneca's plays and not just his letters or his treatises on mercy or on anger that some of you know. And he makes it very clear that Stoic grit is social, that we need to depend on others. And it's right there in Marcus Aurelius. He says, if you've ever seen he's writing on the battlefield along the Danube during the Germanic campaigns, first century Common Era. And he says, if you've ever seen legs and arms and fingers separated from the torso, you know what we are if we cut ourselves off from each other. That is what a human makes of herself when she cuts herself off from fellow humans. That, to my mind, is a very strong statement of social capital, as Bob Putnam would say in Bowling Alone, the sociologist at Harvard. That's a really strong claim about how we connect. So that said, how does Seneca deal with it? Well, he has us, it's a fascinating play, and it's Hercules Furens, Hercules Rages. Hercules has just finished all his labors. He's ready to pierce through Hades. He comes dashing through. He can't wait for his homecoming, like a soldier's homecoming. And there he is piercing through Hades. And what happens? Juno, who's still jealous because Hercules is a child of Jupiter from a different wife. So his stepmother is very, very jealous, and she blinds him in a certain way. She makes him go crazy. And crazed, when he pierces through Hades into the real world, he kills his family. And his self-rage is suicidal. He wants to kill himself. And as I read this, I can almost hear so many of the soldiers I've interviewed for 20, 30 years. I could have and I should have. Why didn't I just say that? Why was I standing here rather than there? Why did I let the guy stand up rather than squat? T.M. Gibbons Neff. Why was I squatting when he was standing on the rooftop in Marcia? Why did I let the guy relieve himself at that moment when he got blown up? And then the place was riddled with mines and he got blown up. So you can hear a soldier struggling. I can when I listen to Hercules. And in this Stoic play, the Stoic grit, though, comes from outside, not self-reliance, but from outside. And says Hercules' father in the most compassionate line, "The grief is yours, but the guilt is your stepmother's. Bad luck is not your fault." And his closest friend is even more direct to him. He says, "Use your heroic courage, Hercules, to show yourself mercy." So this is a very important lesson, I think, from the Stoic texts about turning to others for help. I say this not lightly. It is very, very hard to convince someone whose career is on the line to seek counsel, therapeutic counsel. But it is critical, and it's from the leadership down that the message has to come. And so this is a very important play for that. And the idea of seeing mercy through someone else's eyes, the compassionate other, is actually a technique used in the VA. Brett Litz at the Boston VA, Shira McGuinn, colleagues of mine at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, and the San Francisco VA, they use a method. It's a bad, horrible name. It's called adaptive disclosure. But the gist is empty chair technique. Bring an empty chair into the room, fill that empty chair in your mind's eye, in your imagination, with a beneficent person, a benevolent person who has moral authority in your life. And imagine if that person now in the room, this benevolent moral authority, would blame you in the same way you blame yourself. Or swap roles. Would you blame that person who's also stuck, psychologically stuck in the way you are, for what she did? Or would you give them a bit of a pass and help them work through it? That's a very important modality of finding self-forgiveness, self-empathy, self-mercy. And I think you can hear it resonating a little bit in the play, but you also hear it in this technique. So I want to finish with one other, two quick bits of Seneca. So we have time for question, answer, if that works with you guys. And I'm now going to think about Seneca's essay on mercy and a kind of theatrical twin, which is the Trojan women. So on mercy, we think is addressed to Nero, and it's essentially show some mercy in your life, Nero, and it's also a public plea. There's been a lot of forced suicides and killings in the palace, and it's a plea to the public to have some mercy, perhaps, toward this emperor. Seneca is Nero's speechwriter. I don't know if he's so much a moral tutor, but he is a speechwriter, imperial advisor. What goes around comes around, and he doesn't end up well at the end, but Nero demands his death too, because he thinks that he's plotting against him. But Nero has his ears some of the time. And in a play, Trojan Women, there's a sense that we need mercy, not just for ourselves, which I was arguing is the case in Hercules Rages, but we need to show mercy toward others. So this is fittingly an end of war play. It's about what we call post-bellum, after war. The Trojans have finished. The Greeks are finished. They're ready to leave. And the Greeks, the victors, with Ulysses as the commander, want now to take their plunder. It's horrible. Rape and pillage is what's going to happen after war. And in particular, Hecuba, Priam's wife, might be taken, and also the children and grandchildren. And one of them is a little boy, Astyanax, and then also a young girl, Polyxena. And they have to be sacrificed somehow, because somehow yet another generation of Trojan War might happen if we allow them to live and become the next generation of warriors. So it's the transmission of war trauma that has to be somehow stopped. So Ulysses is going to do something horrible. He's going to kill the little boy. And the mother pleads, don't take him. He's innocent. You can't, he's too young to start a war again. And she says, have you no mercy? And says Ulysses to her, Odysseus, otherwise, I wish I could be merciful, but I cannot, because the war will go on if I am. And he also, in a very repeated meme, needs to please the gods somehow in order to have the wind set sail. Once again, the Greeks never have the right wind to get their ships back home or get their ships out to war. And it's a stunning example of rage. And what happens, this little boy is thrown off a mountaintop near where his grandfather Priam had his watchtower, his war watchtower, and he's shattered. In the play, you sort of can almost hear the brain sputtering open. And so let me just now, I'll bring you back to the screen in a half sec, but what you get is a sense of, I'm going to fast forward to Lane McDowell. Lane McDowell returned from war to find a little boy whose head was split open because of war. And so what you hope, I always hope with those I work with, that there can be some mercy toward others, self-mercy toward self-forgiveness, a way of moving on. And I think we all play a role. But if you think about Stoic wisdom, it really is about the social supports of being connected in the way that Marcus Aurelius says we are. If you've seen a corpse separated from itself, or a torso separated from arms and legs on a battlefield, that's what we make of ourselves when we fail to see that we are somehow integrated in our common humanity and depend upon each other. And so I think of Stoic wisdom, just to sort of end this, and I'll show a few slides to end it. I think of Stoic wisdom as really, let's see if we can you see that? Did I get it? Good. You can think of Stoic wisdom as a certain kind of the building of social capital. And so here we've got, this is a wonderful Rubens picture of Seneca getting ready to commit suicide on Nero's orders. And guess what? He is surrounded by those who are going to help him face his death, to face his mortality. A little better. And I thank you so much. Stop share.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. That was terrific. We have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. If you have a comment or question, please use the chat function. Professors Watling and Young are going to moderate the Q&A, and I think we have one question already from our colleague, Professor Lutton. Willie or Gab, do you want to share that, or?
Sure. Nancy, thank you.
My pleasure.
So in terms of sort of the Stoic disposition, right, and you mentioned that it's fairly widespread and also encouraged in the military. I mean, what Brahm is asking here is sort of kind of what's the basis, or what is the disposition that you think leads soldiers to be sort of, you know, engaged with Stoicism in the military context, or why is it a moral worldview that tends to resonate with soldiers in particular, like sort of to embrace the suck, as you said?
I think there's no one single answer to this. Some of it is that, well, boot camp, training, 4 years at an academy like West Point or Naval or Air Force, there's a lot of deprivation. It is tough. I was just teaching a class in which I have a 35-year-old Marine reservist, heads a unit of company of 135 on a forced march in the middle of Michigan this last weekend, humping a 40-pound rucksack, and one fell out, and he said the pain was really tough, you know, keeping up that pace. He's leading. He sort of put it, you've got to learn to sort of not, he used it in Stoic terms, he's a very scholar warrior. You've got to learn to not assent at times to the pain, to keep it there. And then a whole conversation about it arose, is how long can you keep it out there and not process it. But I think part of it is a very demanding career. And Stoicism is often about learning to try to gain as much control of yourself as you can, especially in circumstances that aren't always favorable. And so it's sort of, to my mind, it makes sense to have it. It's also, for various reasons, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus have become, I'll call them secular heroes in the military world. Again, anecdotal, but one of my students, again, these are graduate students in security studies and foreign service at Georgetown, who will go on to work at the Pentagon or other places. And one said, you know, you're allowed to carry, I don't know if this is true, but in the Army, he said, you're allowed to carry only one kind of book in your rucksack if you're in battle, and that is a religious book. But one person was carrying Marcus Aurelius, and he was given special dispensation to carry it, because I think this person thought Marcus Aurelius was inspiration. And certainly General Mattis speaks very often about Marcus Aurelius, a tattered copy in his rucksack.
That is interesting. Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to follow that question up with a question from our colleague Bram Lutton, who is asking, he's curious if there is a source, for example, books, websites, etc., for the practices of Stoicism, meditation, journal reflection, etc. And would you be able to relate these practices to modern cognitive behavioral therapy? I'm not sure if Marcus Aurelius connects there, but I'll hand that over to you.
There's a lot of them. There's a whole industry in it. And when I say a mega industry, I mean a mega industry. Folks, one of them who I actually think is a reasonably good scholar, not as much a scholar, but a practitioner, a CBT practitioner, cognitive behavioral therapy, excuse me, is Donald Robertson, who engages in a cognitivist inspired view of Stoicism. The Stoics were cognitivists. They were prescient in this regard. They thought emotions were cognitive. There's only one kind of stuff of the psyche, and that's reason, unlike Plato, desire, your thumos or spirit, and your your reason. They just had one kind, and emotions were thoroughgoingly reasoned. So I think there are that way. I'm sure if you poke around, others are out there as well. Ryan Holiday certainly has a huge industry going of daily Stoic Digest and podcasts. There are more than you would want to know, and many sometimes knock on my doors, and I have to figure out, how did you come to Stoicism? And tell me more about your journey and how you found Stoicism. So thank you for that question, Bram.
Okay. Willie, would you like to take the next one?
Sure. We have one from Megan, but I'm going to actually go to a question from Hope Deckers, and we can come back to Megan's in a minute. But Nancy, Hope was asking about the quote from Hercules about the grief being his, but the guilt being belonging to his stepmothers, right? And
Yes.
what Hope asked was, like, do you believe that many soldiers who struggle with coming to terms with their moral distress, you believe they're able to achieve that level of understanding?
It's a great question. I think it takes the right kind of care. It may take the right people to help. Many don't want to talk. My dad was a World War II veteran and really never talked about his war until the very end. So I think it takes a lot of trust. It takes understanding that the people that you can talk to aren't necessarily, or aren't only the people in your unit, which is often the way it goes. And I think it takes leaders, I really do. The higher up, the better, who publicly say it's okay, and who don't kill you for your, kill your career for seeking out help. So I think that's really, really critical. But in reading that play, I really did think about the letter writing activities that Shira McGuinn, for example, and her team at UCSF and the SF San Francisco VA engage in. I mean, some of them are very, you wouldn't believe this, but people 50 years later are writing to the soldier they killed in Vietnam. And still remembering the letter they pulled out of a pocket that made that corpse a person who has a family, who won't come home to that family. And I think, or maybe World War II, and they believe that, in the case of World War II, many believe that the war was just, their conduct was just. So this is not immoral behavior or unjust conduct or unjust war behavior, but nonetheless, it's very hard to sort out the killing in war and sorting it out with your civilian conscience. And it's also too few that go to war. 1% is, I think, what the Council on Foreign Service now puts it at, our current military engagement. So we outsource, I would say we outsource duty in many ways.
Well, that actually does connect to Megan's question, because Megan Hemingway is wondering what role can the military itself take to help soldiers who are suffering from such intense self-loathing / moral dilemma. So it's interesting that that this is outsourced. The care for those soldiers is largely outsourced.
Well, it's not just the care. I was thinking, so I have colleagues who are former military. One teaches at Naval Postgrad, B.J. Strausser is his name, and another one who's a West Point guy and a ranger. And I'm not sure where he is right now, but they're both philosophers. And they have a book coming out, Outsourcing Duty, I think is its name. I wrote a foreword for it, so I read it just recently. And the gist of it is that with the all volunteer armed forces, which have been all volunteers since the end of the Vietnam War, since about 1973, 75, 73, 75, that very few fight. And we draw from disproportionately from certain demographics. I mean, these reasons are opportunities for education. The thought is for work afterwards, see the world. I often hear many certain sense of duty, especially post 9/11, when enlistments were very high. And very few who don't go to war, and very few of late in the halls of the Capitol, know much about military service. I mean, this was a very big issue in the last election and some of the campaign speeches. And that said, you know, I've often felt, well, how do we share the burden? So part of my listening in classrooms, part of, I'm sure you're giving an Art of War seminar, bringing in those who are reservists, those who are who've recently come back from wars, the GI Bill and all, are ways of letting others in the civilian community hear directly from those who have been to war. But that said, very few go to war, or even not, you don't have to say war, very few put on a uniform, whether they go to war or not. And I think as a, you know, you might say it's exploitative, because the moral burdens are very great. You think about many of your students are 18 to 22. It wasn't during my age, drinking age was 21 in many states. You couldn't vote until you were 21, and yet you could sign up at 18. There is a lot heavier decision making that goes on in war fighting than in, I think, casting ballot or buying a beer at a store.
Mm.
And if that's the case, the moral deliberation, especially with forward operating bases, squads of 4 who are very far away from command, you know, they have the eyes and ears on what they have to do right now when they're dealing in a population-centric warfare. That's a lot of very, very complex moral decision making on an 18 to 22-year-old. And even those that go, like my students, graduate Georgetown, ROTC, they'll be young lieutenants or whatever. They're leading at 22 a unit. That's so sobering. It's quite a sobering thought. Thank you, Megan, for that, wherever you are. in the grid of tiles that jumps around and et cetera.
Okay. We do have some more questions.
I'll make them short. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to quickly get in. Bram Lutton also mentions Robertson's book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, The Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, which I think you mentioned yourself, and he recommends that as well. We also have a question from Kylie Breen, who is asking about different ideologies behind how to measure what is ethical or not. In your conversations and studies with people in the military, have you noticed any trends in how people define what is morally right or wrong? And I just have to turn my oven off, so I'll be back in 2 seconds.
What's cooking?
Chicken pie.
Okay. I don't know about ideologies, but you know, this is what we teach in ethics classes, and so certainly when I was teaching at the Naval Academy, what we would standardly teach was versions of utilitarianism, utilitarianism, Kantian ethics. So consequences matter. Proportionality is a consequentialist notion. Discrimination, minimizing collateral damage. Those are Kantian notions, essentially. Integrity and virtue take you back to the Greeks and ancient Greek-Roman ethics. So if I had to say, those would be what I would turn to, and also, of course, the Stoics. Many come in with morality that's very nurtured through home, religion, or whatever other sources we get. And as philosophers, we always try to think, are they good ideologies that they're following? Or how can we help clarify some of the moral complexities of life?
Nancy, can I follow up a bit on a couple of things you talked about, just in terms of the masks first,
Yeah.
right? Because for me, one of the things that stands out about the Stoics is the focus kind of on changing judgments, right? And so I'm curious about with the masks and also with the plays, and so maybe kind of just more generally with the ways that art can help soldiers change their judgments of themselves, right? Or like, are the masks moving from being disfiguring to like sort of transfiguring? Like what's the process that goes on in that artistic endeavor that helps them as they're going through this?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not an art therapist, and I've talked a little bit to Melissa Walker, who is the sponsor of this modality. I think generally the thought is many find images and not words, the medium. Just as, I dance a bit, and, I've talked to dance therapists. It's a very different medium to be able to hold someone, feel someone, see them in movement, that kind of thing. And so I don't quite get how the brain works, but we know that therapies, and including art therapy, with young children, working with sand and the like, different modalities open up different avenues. Now, in terms of judgment for the Stoics, being able to cognitively shift and come to different valuations or appraisals of how you see the appearances out there, which is sort of their idea. In that regard, I mean, I don't know if the masks would be part of that story, and how to think of Seneca in terms of showing plays. I mean, Seneca is just a complex literary artist. He writes plays, he writes speeches, he writes letters in his retirement, as he's forced from public life and is in the Outs with Nero. And so he's a man of letters, and he wants to be remembered. There's no doubt about that. He was. I mean, we're reading him in it. So, but he also is picking up on the philosophy. He's a subscriber to the idea of judgment and change. So I don't know if I can tell a coherent story. It would be good if I could, of how seeing yourself in a different way through the mask is a way of shifting perspective and judgment. That would be certainly the hope. But some of it is simply to unlock demons. I mean, you saw the demons that are inside and the expression of some of these masks.
Right, sure, absolutely. No, I mean, even just at that level, I would think that's important, even if it's not the conscious judgment that's being changed. Yeah. Good. Gab, do you have something else you'd like to follow up on?
I was interested in, certainly in literature, we think of masks as representing an alternative personality. The masks that we saw seem to not be masks at all. They seem to represent the true suffering of the artist, rather than a device that would hide the true suffering of the artist. So it's very interesting that masking is used to actually expose rather than to hide in this case.
It's a wonderful comment, because in conversations Mark, Gab, and Willie had prior to this, Mark had mentioned the World War I masks, which did hide as opposed to show. These are masks used because of severe facial disfigurement in World War I. And tin masks, they were called. And, you would go to the tin mask maker in hospitals. And at that time, they brought the folks that were making the prosthetics, facial prosthetics, were making prosthetics, actually brought in the heads of schools at, Slade Art or whatever the art schools of the time, Courtauld or whatever they were at the time in London. And they worked with the hospitals in conjunction. So there were artists who were working with mask makers, metal makers and the like, prosthetic makers. And this is the subject of Toby's Room, one of Pat Barker's later novels, not the original trilogy that I believe you're studying, Regeneration. And those are concealing, and they were very hard. It was hard to breathe through them. One guy would say, I feel like I'm talking through bubbles, you know, because you've got a whole mask on. And someone says, you know, you look just like Rupert Brooke or something like that. And because he had a mask that was made to look like Rupert Brooks, this World War I hero. And so, yes, concealing versus exposing, or, you know, interesting topic.
Great.
Certainly.
Well, Nancy, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and really appreciate it. And great discussion, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank
This
you.
concludes our program. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much. May we see each other in good times. Stay safe, stay healthy, or as someone I know says, if you can't be good, be careful. Okay. Thank you
Great.
again.
Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for your questions.